Hey guys, I hope you're having a great week. Today I have a really good video for you guys. It's an incredible interview between Simon Hill and CEO of the Every Company, Arturo Elizondo. Simon Hill is a podcaster. He's a nutritionist and a physiotherapist, and I believe he's also vegan, but he has a really great podcast. And about a week ago, he did an interview with Arturo where they cover everything about the Every Company, what they're working on, the technology behind it, how precision fermentation works, and what the regulatory landscape is for cellular agriculture. So if you're investing in this space, this really is a must-watch video, even if you don't particularly care about the Every Company, because it just goes into really everything about the technology. And so they have about 2 hours of talk in the description. I put the link to the full podcast. I've just cut up a few clips that I thought were particularly helpful. So in this video, we're going to start with a look at what the current chicken egg industrial farming system is like, how it's fucked up, and then we're going to go into their interview, and then I'm just going to share a few thoughts at the end of the video. I hope you enjoy.
Eggs are big business. Australians eat around 6.5 billion of them a year, and each of those eggs comes from a chicken. One of the roughly 21 million layer hens across the country, each one bred specifically for egg production. But of course, only female chickens lay eggs. So what happens to all the male chicks born into the egg industry? Over the years, the chicken industry has developed two very different breeds of chickens. Layers, bred to lay eggs, and meat chickens, also known as broilers, bred to grow as much flesh as possible. Male layer chicks don't grow large enough to be sold for meat, and farms consider them financially worthless. So the egg industry does the only thing that makes economic sense to them. They kill these baby chickens. More than 12 million of them a year, usually on their first day of life. The egg industry uses two main methods to kill chicks. The first is gassing chambers, which render chicks unconscious using carbon dioxide. The other method of killing, which the industry considers most efficient, is called maceration. Along with gassing, maceration is used across all egg production systems: caged, barn-laid, free-range, and organic. It's also what the industry does to millions of meat chicks that they consider unviable. Every day in hatcheries across Australia, thousands of male chicks are sorted from the females. They are then poured from crates onto conveyor belts. Shunted along, they bounce off the belt's rails and each other. Finally, they drop off the edge of the belt, and their bodies are torn apart by a metal grinder. All of this is legal and commonplace. When the egg industry looks at these chicks, it doesn't see living, thinking, feeling beings. It just sees an inconvenience to be dealt with. At the end of the day, these are profit-driven industries that are trying to meet demand for a product. As people buy more and more eggs, the egg industry finds ways to produce them as cheaply and efficiently as possible. Creating machines to kill chicks en masse is the clinical result of this drive for efficiency. But there's a silver lining. We have the power to stop this. By choosing to eat fewer eggs, or cutting them out altogether and using egg replacements instead, we can reduce demand. This not only sends the message that the horrific practice of chick shredding has to end, it also prevents the violent deaths of millions of chicks.
That's pretty fucked up. Have to say, I'm at a loss for words because I'm not vegan myself, and I've never really thought that eggs were that bad, and I didn't know that that's how they dealt with things. But if you think about it, it makes sense, because what are you going to do with all the males? I think if you have a normal farm, you'll keep them and just raise them as chickens. But in this highly industrialized system, which we've pushed to the brink, there's no economic incentive to do anything but kill the male chickens. So now we're going to get into what the new world of egg protein looks like, and it's super exciting. I think you'll love it, and it's just so much better than what we have today. So I hope you enjoy the interview.
And other companies have been using, that's when he was like, look, we actually could use the fermentation technology to make eggs, because eggs actually don't have any cells. They're just proteins, fats, and water for the most part. And so from a technical feasibility standpoint, it made a ton of sense. And then when I started looking at the research and the business side, it's like eggs were actually super expensive. And egg whites specifically, which were much simpler as a product, were even more expensive because Subway had just launched the egg white, breakfast, the egg white delight for their breakfast. McDonald's had launched the egg white, the egg white McMuffin, and almost every restaurant was launching a healthier breakfast options. And so eggs had gone through the roof from a pricing standpoint. And so I was like, look, the business is there. The B2B angle I thought was really compelling, because eggs are not just a tasty product, but they're a critical ingredient in so many things. Like they're in cakes and patties and and protein bars. I mean, they're in face masks, and all of these companies, I couldn't imagine them wanting to be using eggs, except for the fact that they just do things that nothing else can do, and so they're very hard to replace. And so I found that the B2B angle was very compelling, because it aligned very much with the way that I saw the world, which was, I don't want to convince people to buy our products. I want to make it just so easy that they're buying already. Like my mom and dad, I've been vegan for 10 years. They still eat steak as often as they get there, as often as they can. And they know how much this means to me. And so if my parents and my siblings are still eating the way that we ate growing up, I'm realizing consumer habits and changing them is incredibly difficult. But my mom buys the same cake, for Christmas every year, more or less the same grocery list. And so we could work with the brands that she already buys and that consumers already buy, and just, revamp the back end of food production without compromising the consumer experience. I thought that's how we can make a massive, massive difference in our food system. If we work in the back end and work with all the world's biggest companies and then scale much, much faster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And for folks that maybe are hearing B2B for the first time, that means essentially creating these ingredients, products, and selling them to other businesses, which are then using them in their formulations, food products, as opposed to a B2C customer that would be selling direct to consumer as a brand that you may see on the shelf. I'm curious. So the technology, as I understand it, to produce egg protein through fermentation, that at least some of that technology has existed for quite a long time, 40 plus years. And you can kind of speak to the history of that. But I'm interested, why do you think nobody else had thought about using it to produce egg protein?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one that I was asked almost, every day when I was pitching the company to investors, which is, so one is, yes, the technology has been around for 40 years. And that was shocking to me as well. I'm like, why would we not if this technology works and has been scaled before, why aren't we using this for other applications? And what I realized is that combining disciplines is actually quite hard and not intuitive and quite different. And what I mean by that is this technology had largely lived in pharma companies. Like the technology had been around for 40 years, but actually having people take a technology from one industry and apply it to another doesn't happen very often. Sometimes technologies just live in certain industries for decades. And so Genentech across the street from us, actually here in our labs, was the first ever biotech company in the world. They helped make the first ever animal protein without using an animal. And that protein is insulin. Insulin came from pigs. Before the 80s, we had to kill a pig to get the insulin protein. You have to kill the pig, extract the insulin protein from their pancreas, purify it, and then inject it into people. And that's how every diabetic got their insulin protein from. Otherwise, they would die. And it wasn't kosher, it wasn't halal, it wasn't vegan. But if you wanted to live as a diabetic, you had to get your insulin protein. And that was the only way to do it. Genentech found a way to essentially 3D print that DNA sequence encoded in that codes for the insulin protein. So all proteins in the world are encoded by 4 letters, right? A, T, C, and G. In the same way that all computers are encoded by zeros and ones. So those 4 letters code for every protein in the world, and depending on how they're arranged, code for specific kinds of proteins. And Genentech found a way to 3D print that DNA and code that into a microbe and then ferment it and then have it print out that specific protein. So fast forward to today, 99% of insulin is no longer made by pigs, but by fermenters. And so we thought, this is a very cool technology. Can we actually use the same technology, and instead of making pig proteins, and now pharma companies all over the world use this technology to make other kinds of medicines, other kinds of drugs. So this technology has been, a lot of the medicines that we consume today and that we inject into our blood today are made using the exact same technology, but it hadn't really been used in food in a significant way because it was pretty cost prohibitive. Insulin is very expensive, and just as a fun fact, you needed to kill over 50,000 pigs to make 1 kilo of insulin protein.
So if I'm kind of hearing you correctly, of course, being able to produce meat and complete eggs and whatnot is important, and hopefully we get to a future where that's happening through cellular agriculture and precision fermentation. But it sounds like there's a whole lot of other proteins, animal-derived proteins in our food system that perhaps people are not aware of. They're not as tangible, and that companies like yours and some of the ingredients that you're producing to begin with, or the proteins, can actually make a huge difference simply by being an ingredient within existing products.
Exactly. And what was the craziest part is that it's not just that it lived in pharma, it was actually already in food when we started the company. So 10 years later, the dairy industry took note of this technology and started making a protein called rennet using this technology. And for context, rennet is a protein that is used to curdle the milk to make cheese. And the only way to make cheese industrially was to get the rennet from baby cows that were only a couple of days old. And the rennet could only be found in the 4th stomach of baby cows. So you have to kill the baby cow, extract the rennet protein from their 4th stomach, throw that into milk, and have it curdle to make cheese. And at the time, that was so cheese wasn't vegetarian up until the 90s. So the only way at scale, the only way to produce cheese was by killing baby cows. And now fast forward to today, after some of these companies started making the rennet protein using fermentation, around 90% of the cheese in the US and around over 80% of the cheese produced in the world is made using fermentation. And so we thought, look, we've replaced the pig for insulin protein production as a society. We replaced the baby cow for rennet protein production. We thought, can we replace the chicken for egg protein production? And can we replace animals more broadly from the protein production process? And that's really the innovation that we're creating here, is democratizing that technology and applying that across the board.
It's great to have those examples because I think it does make it less science fiction-y when you can explain that we're already using this on scale in other areas. I've had a guy called Jared Rains on the show previously. He's from a company in Australia called All G Foods that are interested in using precision fermentation to produce dairy products, mostly milk they're looking at. So we did talk a little bit about the sort of process of using microbes and the DNA sequencing that's involved, but it is a bit of a sort of complex area for someone that's hearing this for the first time. So perhaps we just tread through that in a little bit more detail. Can you kind of explain that process? What is a 3D printed DNA sequence? Sort of where do you get that from? And when you say you encode a microbe or put that into a microbe, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, happy to. I'll take a step back, and I think the easiest way for me to understand it was microbes are like little factories. And so in the same way that brewers use yeast to convert sugar into alcohol to make beer and wine, bakers use yeast to convert sugar into carbon dioxide to leaven bread. And yeast can also be used to convert sugar into proteins or sugar into lipids, into different kinds of molecules. And so yeast just basically rearrange carbon and other other atoms into and reconfigure them to make different kinds of compounds. And so, and all of those instructions are encoded by DNA. And so what we do is we work with the yeast that naturally makes protein, that naturally converts sugar into protein, instead of using the yeast that converts it into alcohol or carbon dioxide or something else. But then what we do is that instead of having the yeast make any kind of protein, there are online databases that have all of the proteins known to man. And by what I mean by those proteins is that, for example, hemoglobin, right? For the different kinds of egg white proteins, different kinds of dairy proteins, different kinds of human proteins, they're all online. And when you get the DNA sequence that codes for each of those proteins, there are companies out there that have been around for decades that literally that synthesize that DNA and package it into like little tubes that then what we call plasmids, and those are already encoded for a specific protein. That protein that DNA sequence gets sprinkled into the yeast, and the yeast actually naturally, by poking little holes in their cell wall, you can integrate the DNA sequence into the yeast. And so as the yeast starts eating the sugar, instead of producing anything, it starts actually reading that DNA sequence as it metabolizes and starts producing that specific protein. And so that's not the innovation. That's every biotech company in the world. That's what biotechnology is. Every biotech company in the world uses that technology. What we specialize on is essentially designing and programming these yeast to not just become any kind of computer, but become supercomputers that can produce these proteins at very, very high levels that make them actually affordable for the food industry and for consumers, because insulin and these other medicines, they're thousands of dollars per kilogram. So you can make any protein, and you don't need very high yields to make them profitably. But for us, the key crux is, how do we actually democratize this technology?
So presumably then a key part of your kind of intellectual property and any of the companies that are in this space is that the microbe that you're working with and how you've programmed them to be those supercomputers. Would that be something that's quite unique between companies?
Exactly. And then you can essentially specialize, like make those yeast eat like such great computers for specific kinds of proteins, or for like for us, we've designed and made our microbe just really efficient at producing animal proteins very efficiently across the board.
Got you. So that microbe in your instance produces this protein. You then separate them and you end up just selling the protein that's been produced. I think there are probably plenty of skeptics out there. We hear a whole lot of confusion and discussion about genetic modification.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you get this all the time. From what I'm hearing, there's genetic modification is used, genetic material, it is then separated and it's not in the kind of end product that someone consumes. But if someone's listening and thinking, this sounds a bit sus, what would you kind of like them to better understand about the process?
Well, I would say that there's like that's those are all fair questions and fair concerns. That's why for us, and again, it's a technology, right? You can use it for so many different purposes and so many different uses. We try, for us, the real question is, what are we doing to make the world a better place? And let's have that be our true north. And the reason why I say that is because you can actually make any protein on Earth, and even new kinds of proteins, and modify the proteins themselves to have different kinds of amino acid profiles, etc. We only produce proteins that are found in nature. So we do not engineer any of the proteins that we make. They are all the same ones. The same ones that the bodies already recognize as being bioavailable, as being nutritional, and that have a long history of being in our food system for centuries, oftentimes millennia. So I can't speak for other companies, but for us specifically, we only specialize in proteins that have been around in the food industry, in the food system, and in our bodies for centuries, if not millennia, and we don't change them.
If you put your egg white proteins under the microscope and you compared them to that from a live chicken egg, or from a live chicken that had an egg, would it look exactly the same?
Yeah, so this is actually one of the beauties of fermentation, which I love. So the egg white has and the egg has hundreds of proteins, and they all do different things. And so when you eat an egg, you eat all the proteins at the same time, even some proteins that are actually not good for you. So for example, avidin is a protein in the egg white that actually binds to biotin if you don't denature it, i.e. cook it. And so sometimes it can create a biotin deficiency in the body, and that's why certain animals can't consume it, because it actually is not good for them. And so we can remove those proteins that are either like anti-nutrients, that actually are not totally beneficial, because as safe as these proteins are, because we know that they're safe broadly, but the challenge with these proteins is they weren't made for us. Like the chicken egg, right? The proteins in the egg were meant to support the life of a baby, of a chicken embryo, right? And to feed that. And so they just so happen to be also available to humans, and we can process them well, but they weren't necessarily intended for us. And so part of our job is, really deciphering which proteins are awesome and which ones maybe are not so awesome. And so we can actually pick and choose the different proteins and isolate them and use them as individual products. So all to say that the proteins, to answer your question directly, the proteins we produce are identical. So under microscope, they will have the same amino acid profile. They will be processed in the same way as traditional egg white proteins. But it depends. But the combination of them is not what we specialize in. We can combine them in different ways, and that's part of for applications for cakes. You don't necessarily want. You want a protein that can foam really well. And so we can actually dial up some of the foaming properties to create lighter and fluffier kinds of cakes. And then for athletes, we can make, scrambles that have actually a better amino acid profile than those of, than a traditional chicken egg actually. And so that's how we can actually leverage the technology to create foods that are not just just as good as what the animal makes, but how do we actually create food that is designed for the end user?
Mm-hmm. So I guess you're being careful not to overpromise, but you did say you want to replace egg in all its forms, and I'm just curious, with the scientists that you work with and the understanding of kind of what's possible.
Yeah.
Do you think there is a day where you walk into the grocery store and you pick up a carton of 12 eggs and they're produced without needing a chicken at all?
Yeah, 100%.
What is the biggest challenge with regards to scaling all of this? You mentioned before the efficiency of the microbes really important.
Yeah.
We haven't yet spoken about, I guess, the inputs and the amount of those and how much better it is than traditional animal agriculture. But I think that's interesting too. But what are the kind of biggest challenges to ramping this up, being able to provide it on a scale where it is having that significant impact that you're looking for?
Yeah, the biggest challenge to scale is, at this point, scale, like the capacity side. So having enough access to fermentation capacity very quickly, and then that it's affordable. There is some fermentation capacity out there, but there really isn't a ton, and there's long lead times to build these kinds of facilities. So the biggest challenge to scale is just getting large enough capacities online as quickly as possible. The microbes, I mean, the beauty of this technology is that it's hard to imagine a chicken ever getting more efficient than it is today, right? We've sadly over optimized that system where they're laying, almost an egg a day, when in the wild before we engineered them to produce at these kinds of levels, chickens in the wild normally produce between 1 to 2 dozen eggs a year. They're producing over 300 eggs per year today. That means that their bodies often register that as cancer because they're just producing chicken periods, right? That's what eggs are. So to the point where their oviducts actually have tumors around them. And so it's the same with like the chickens for that we use for meat, right? They have that breast so big that their legs break after like a couple of months of being on this earth, because we've bred them to be these monsters because they taste good. And so our approach and the beauty of our technology is that we can always optimize our microbes, and that's an ongoing process. There are companies out there that have been optimizing their microbes and their yeast for 30 years. And so it's really exciting that we continue getting better and better and better. And even once we beat the chicken, we can make our proteins even more affordable. So that way, every person on this earth, not just the people in LA and Melbourne and Sydney and, San Francisco and New York, can get access to them, but really every human in the world, and to make global hunger a thing of the past. That should not, in a world this rich, food should be the last thing people should be worrying about.
I see often online people kind of questioning, how much better is this for the environment? And I read a paper that was published in Nature. It was just about a week or so ago on microbial protein. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but it was more centered around what are the benefits of shifting. It looked at 20% of protein from ruminant animals to microbial protein. And so not relating to egg protein per se, but still an interesting paper. And their kind of modeling showed that just replacing 20% of the global ruminant meat on a per capita basis, it would pretty much halve the annual deforestation and related carbon emissions. And that's just one solution of many. I'm curious, from your perspective, when it comes to eggs, how much better is what you're doing as a company and particularly on scale going to be for the environment compared to traditional chicken farming?
We're going through that process right now. So now that we're scaling, because we did some initial analyses when we were at lab scale, but it's just not representative of what I wanted. Real numbers that we can stand behind from our like larger scale operations, and that's what we're going through now. So in a few months we should have that data, but we should be better across almost every dimension than the animal and combat industry. The question is not if, it's by how much. And that's something that I want to highlight with a lot of folks, because this is something that I think from my days in government was very salient, which is, we like to hold people to these impossible standards. And I remember when President Obama was running for re-election, people were like, oh, well, he didn't do enough and he didn't do this and he didn't do that. And like, and why, why didn't he do this? And he was supposed to be doing all of these, he had all these, we had all these aspirations for this person. And so because he didn't get to all of those things, he shouldn't, he shouldn't be reelected. And one of the things that Joe Biden said is, don't compare him to the Almighty, compare him to the alternative. And for me, that hits home because this is not the panacea. We need every solution on the table, and let's not start figuring, comparing and fighting against these little, which technology is better, which one is worse. At the end of the day, either we need every solution on the table, and whether it's having your own little chickens in your backyard, right? Like people are saying, well, what about animals? And like, it's right now the problem and the default, the de facto MO of this world is industrialized factory farms where we produce over 90% of the meat, milk, and eggs that we consume. And that is an ill of this world that needs to not exist for us to continue live, for us to have a shot at averting this climate catastrophe. And so my hope is that at the end of the day, these technologies, whether it's us or all of these other companies, as long as we are doing, that we are all fighting the good fight, and not every solution is going to be the best one for everyone. And that's the beauty of food, right? There's a billion brands when you go to a grocery store, and you as a consumer get to pick and choose what you want. No one's shoving it down your throat. If you want almond milk, great. If you want soy milk, great. As long as you're not drinking the factory farmed milk, you can drink from the 20 different options that are on that are at the grocery store. And I want the same thing to happen across every category, and that people have the choice to pick their winners and pick their cup of tea.
Talk to me about regulations.
Are you talking practically or hypothetically? If I had a magic wand, like what would I do?
I think let's stick to practical. So in the current environment that exists, with your understanding of the policies that are in place, with your understanding of the funding or lack of funding, if there was greater political will, what would you like to see?
So, okay, I'll still say the hypothetical, which is, I mean, if we had enough political, which I think other countries can do, I just don't see it in the US. But it's not even a hard ask. It is just, look, let's level the playing field. Don't give us any money. Just remove the subsidies. Like, we have a subsidy regime in the US against the worst foods for us. Like, there's a reason why the cheapest foods are the most terrible for us. It's not by accident. And so as long as we can remove the subsidies from and just put that money back into people's pockets, or do something, focus on reforestation or something else. But we don't even have to give money to companies like us or this movement. Just level the playing field so we can really compete like the free market, which is what we claim that we stand for. So that's like one kind of dream aspiration that I have, is just a level playing field. But in terms of the practicality of it, I think the most practical way that we can, if there's some political will, which I think is actually quite plausible, is whenever we're talking about competitiveness, which in the US now is becoming a bigger and bigger conversation, is how do we stay on top, or how do we not keep falling behind? And so how do we stay competitive with new technologies, semiconductors, et cetera, lithium-ion batteries? That's a conversation that's already happening. Let's include alternate proteins in there whenever these new industries are getting supported from government. Just add alternative proteins as part of that mandate. And so whatever funds are going towards, lithium ion batteries, towards these other initiatives also go towards alternative proteins. And that way, we can ensure that we as a country are staying on top of things, because, China just announced in their 5-year agricultural plan, President Xi Jinping, alternative proteins as a core part of their future food strategy, in a way that in the U.S. that, I don't know how many billions of dollars have gone into, into traditional animal ag, but there was an amendment filed where there was $5 million allocated for alternative proteins. And that was like a huge moment for the space. And so you see that, we've raised $200 million in private capital. $5 million from the U.S. government for the entire industry is, it's symbolic more than anything, but it is really a drop in the ocean, and we need a lot more support if we're going to be competitive.
It's pleasing to see China doing that. I wonder if their government is under the same amount of pressure from lobbyists, and I guess that kind of extends to something else I wanted to ask you about, which was the egg industry and how you feel going forward, what that relationship will look like. Are they going to be heavily threatened and in opposition to what you're doing, or is it something that you think they will embrace and get involved with?
It's going to be it's a toss up, as we've seen with the existing players today, right? You have some of the biggest meat companies like JBS and Tyson and Cargill investing in these companies, not just as active participants, but investing and putting money behind cultivated and plant-based options, those two technologies. And so that already, we already see that with smart companies that are forward looking. I see that very similarly with the egg industry. There are some egg companies that we're talking to that want to partner because they have distribution and they know that demand for animal protein is continuing to grow. And so we have to find a way that, it's hard to imagine that, the eggs and meat, they just can't scale the way that these technologies can. And so as we provide, for them, for a lot of companies, they're not wedded to the idea of torturing animals. They want to make money, right? They want to exist and want to get people what they want. And whether that's from chicken eggs or from fermentation eggs or plant-based eggs, they're pretty open. And I think when we talk to several companies, some of them actually have already launched their own plant-based eggs or launched their own plant-based options. Like Brazil's largest egg company launched a plant-based egg. And so there are a lot of really thoughtful companies that want to stay relevant because they know if they don't, they'll end up like Kodak, and they don't want to.
3 takeaways. First takeaway is that this technology has been around for 40 years. We just haven't applied it to food. We've been applying it to medicine. We've applied it to beer. And so it's really not a question of developing rocket science, new technologies, creating a new battery for EVs. We just need to scale this. And so if you look at agronomics at their portfolio companies, there is a precision fermentation contractor. So that's one of the startups that's in the space. So you really need to start looking at all the companies that are in the space and how they're all working together. We have food companies who are creating the proteins. We have precision fermentation companies who are the manufacturers. Some of the food companies are going to be doing the manufacturing as well. And that leads me to the second takeaway, which is this precision fermentation technology applies to meat, cheese, milk, dairy products, eggs, medicine, beer, fish, oils. It applies to all kinds of foods. And the manufacturers like AB InBev, which was mentioned in the video, people who know how to ferment things are going to do very well. And then the people who own the IP in terms of how do we scale up the microbes and generate the microbes in such a way that's cost effective are going to do very well. So those two players are probably going to be the winners in the marketplace as we continue to develop. so far, what I learned, that's what I'm getting. Third thing is much longer term. Think 50 years into the future. We're looking at really having food that is specifically tailored to each individual. I don't expect everybody is going to want this, at least to start. It's going to be a niche market to start, but maybe things will eventually go in that direction. Who knows? That's future speculation. But really, we're going to be saying, like, okay, let's look at Jim. How's Jim's health? What's his DNA? What are his physical properties? What are his goals? Okay, how do we then create proteins that are specifically personalized for Jim? One place that I see this personalization of food, where that's going to be super, super important and desired, is in the sports industry. If you're an athlete, you want to get the best possible food that you can get for your body type so that you can perform as best as you possibly can. So that's going to be one place. The other one is going to be, as people become more and more health conscious, stop drinking, taking exercise more seriously, taking their health more seriously, as we look into more longevity, as people get into more thinking about, okay, how can I live a longer, healthier life? Personalized food is going to be huge into reaching that goal as well. How do we get personalized food that's actually going to help you reach your goals and make your body healthier than if you're just eating what everybody else eats? So those are my 3 takeaways. Let me know what you found, and please watch the entire interview. Super, super, super important for anyone who's investing in this space. And I'd love to hear in the comments what you thought, what your takeaways are, because I'm sure there's a lot more that I haven't picked up on. I probably want to watch this video a couple times. But yeah, I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope it was helpful. See you next time.